Thank you for coming here today. Hope you have a good lunch. My name is Katerina. I am a researcher at CRESST at UCLA. And I organized this session called Social Emotional Learning as the New Frontier, Frameworks, Measurement, and Interventions. I'm really excited to have all of the other speakers here, including Buckley from Transforming Ed, Sandra Graham, who's a professor at UCLA Grad School of Education and Information Studies, and Jessica Berlinski from Ripple Effects. I am also speaking. I hesitated to put my name on the slide because what I'm going to speak to you about is very much a work in progress and just showing all the thoughts that I've been having about this topic. And I specifically chose these three speakers because they show very kind of diverse ways of thinking about social emotional learning from, thinking about diversity, measurement, interventions, and assessment. So to set the stage, last year, $640 million were spent on products falling under the category of social emotional learning. This was Title II funding under ESSA to provide support for SEL skills and development. U.S. K-12 public schools devoted a total of approximately $21 to $47 billion per year in SEL by a report by Transforming Education. This is like multiple times over the NSF annual budget. That's the one I'm familiar with because I'm always asking them for funding. So it's a lot of money per year being spent on social emotional learning. Several states, like Kansas and Illinois, have developed standards for social emotional learning, which I think is very interesting. And several school districts, specifically in California, have gotten an ESSA waiver to administer yearly surveys of students' SEL and perceptions of school culture and climate. And these several school districts in California make up close to about 1 million kids a year. So, it has a huge impact. What I'm going to be talking about today are thinking about definitions of social emotional learning, measurement, and environmental influences of social emotional learning. Again, this is a work in progress, and I come at it from a background in motivation. So I consider myself an educational psychologist who studies motivational processes and how classrooms and teachers and learning environments influence those. And that should kind of come out when I talk about these definitions of SEL. So right now, and as I'll show, SEL is kind of defined as this, like, I would consider it a murky pool. Like we have a lot of things that we call SEL, but we don't have any kind of clear distinctions on what we think about it. And I would probably argue that from a measurement perspective, it's much easier to measure something like this, finding the sea stars and the shells in the clear water versus trying to pick out these things in murky water. Historically, conceptions of SEL have come from a variety of different fields, which I think that's why this is such a big, broad topic that's getting a lot of attention. Economics kind of famously considers them non-cognitive skills, and I'll show you what exactly they mean by that. Clinical psychologists and school psychologists think a lot about the implications of bullying on social emotional learning. Educational psychologists think a lot about self-regulated learning, self-efficacy, growth mindset. And I would argue also that some of it comes from a recognition from practitioners and teachers, realizing that these things are important, whatever they are. So one paper coming from Kuna and Heckman, coming from economists, use the term non-cognitive skills. And I personally like using that word only because it's kind of a catch-all, and I think people kind of understand what you mean when you say non-cognitive. It's kind of a misnomer because, of course, you need your brain and cognitive processes to have these things. But in their paper, they talk about things like perseverance, motivation, self-esteem, and self-control, and they link these things to later life outcomes like income and college going and stuff like that. And to me, they kind of represent this kind of kitchen sink approach when I talk about non-cognitive skills. They're kind of throwing everything in there that probably doesn't fit into math, English language arts, executive functioning skills. The collaborative for academic and social emotional learning has a very nice definition that I would probably consider as maybe the most popular one that everyone's familiar with, and they define SEL as the process through which children and adults acquire and effectively apply the knowledge, attitudes, and skills necessary to understand and manage emotions, set and achieve positive goals, feel and show empathy for others, establish and maintain positive relationships, and make responsible decisions. There's a lot in there, right? And they have their nice figure of how all those pieces fit together. And so they kind of point out several self-beliefs as being important: self-awareness, self-management, more social things that are in green: social awareness, relationship skills, and then in the yellow, responsible decision-making. And they couch it within these different ecosystems, so they think about classrooms, schools, and then the bigger context. I'm going to show you here the Sel Standards from the state of Illinois. And what I really like about their framework is that, and I'll show you this in the next slide, is that they think about it in developmental terms. So as in working with states, they have standards for academic skills, what students should know by the end of kindergarten, first grade, second grade. They've done that with social emotional learning. And I've only put a few of them up here, but you can see there's a lot of very specific language about, ones are about emotion, twos are kind of about perspective taking, etc. And I'll show you this is just part of their developmental trajectory of what kids are expected to know. They've categorized it as these different stages. Stages A and B are something that first graders should know. Stages A through C, second grade, B through D, third grade, et cetera, et cetera. And they have kind of really nice, specific statements of how they operationalize social emotional learning. There's the Core PACE partnership. They also have a framework for social emotional learning. It is also in this kind of round figure that everyone seems to love. And they think about it in terms of growth mindset, self-management, self-efficacy, and self-awareness. So growth mindset is this idea that you can, your brain can change, and if you put enough effort into it, you can learn. Self-efficacy are beliefs about how you think about the task. Self-management is the process by which you set a goal and reach that goal. And social awareness are things like perspective taking. And we also have one from the University of Chicago Consortium for Chicago School Research, another round figure, right, with different colors. And they also talk about mindsets, right? We saw in the previous core piece on the growth mindset, self-regulation, values. They have one here called knowledge and skills, which they define as knowledge as a set of facts, information, or understanding about self, others, and the world. Skills are the learned ability to carry out a task with intended results or goals and can be general to remain specific. So my point, we're not here to memorize all the different frameworks. There are over 136 frameworks to describe SEL, and this comes from a recent report by AIR. It's kind of insane, right? And my perspective as someone who studies, an educational psychologist who studies motivation, I think a lot about the overlap between SEL constructs and motivational constructs. Things like mindsets, self-efficacy, self-regulation even, I would consider very much an exact overlap. So what I'm starting to think about is, are there bigger ways we can categorize these constructs? So we have things like feelings about yourself, things like your own mindset or your implicit theory of intelligence, your feelings about how good you are in a task, self-efficacy, how you feel in a given situation, emotions. Maybe we can also think about categorizing feelings about relationships towards other. So things like social awareness, perspective taking, relationship skills, how do I feel about my teacher? And then maybe another, I'm not sure, can we be self-regulated about our feelings about ourselves? Can we be self-regulated about our feelings and relationships towards others? Maybe. So that might be another bucket: self-regulated learning, regulating your emotion, and behavior and emotion management. So many ways to think about categorizing these SEL constructs. Again, what's considered social emotional learning and what isn't? Help seeking, I think we might all agree that that's part of a self-regulated construct. Perhaps it falls under responsible decision making, relationships skills. I'm not going to seek help from a teacher that I don't like or I don't think can help me. Perhaps all of self-regulated learning should be a chunk of SEL. So in motivation, we define it as the ability to plan, monitor, and regulate behavior towards a specified goal. So can I set a goal? Can I monitor my progress towards that goal? Do I know if something goes wrong, that it is going wrong, and what do I do about it? Do I ask for help? Do I go and study the textbook again? And then can we think about self-regulation of motivation as part of this framework? So again, it seems like everywhere we go, it's this kitchen sink approach, right? There's so many constructs in there. And then we turn to measurement of SEL. As I mentioned earlier, the Core PACE partnership surveys students in elementary, so from 3rd grade to 12th grade annually. And they have 2 separate surveys that they give, one for the elementary school kids and then one for the secondary school kids. That's kind of a huge ask to think that there's just 2 different surveys we can give kids in that huge developmental span. So we have these direct assessments of SELs. So these, either surveys or kind of directly asking kids. There are rating systems that you can give to teachers or caregivers. And there is one, the SELA, the Social Emotional Learning Screening Assessment, that lines directly up to the CASEL framework, which is nice. There's performance tasks, so you give kids an activity online or in person and directly assess how they're doing. Maybe we might be in a world where we can soon have game-based measures of SEL. It's tricky. So I'm going to show you one example of a direct assessment of social emotional learning, and hopefully I can successfully make the point that I'm going to make next. So my colleagues and I developed a growth mindset measure. This is for ages 3 to 5. And we ask kids while they're looking at this castle, so we say, now we're going to talk about trying to do something really hard. Imagine your teacher asks you to work with the wooden blocks to build this very big castle. I'm going to ask you some questions about how you would feel about building this castle. We give them these circles to respond to. So we ask them these 3 questions. Could you figure out how to build this castle if you tried really hard? If you got stuck building this castle, how hard would you keep trying? And do you think you would get better at building the castle if you practiced? So kids pointed their level of agreement using these circles. And one of the things, right, all of us would be curious about is, well, how do the kids answer? And this is data from about 1,100 kids. And most kids, these are the different survey items, so 1, 2, and 3, answered a lot for all of those items. That's good, right? These kids, the majority have, maybe what we would define as a growth mindset. Well, from a measurement perspective, we don't really want to see this, right? We'd rather have like a nice even distribution to say that our measure worked. This kind of example we see a lot when we ask people about their self-efficacy. So we know when kids are really, really young, their self-efficacy is super high. Perhaps it declines over time, or maybe only declines for certain groups. We know boys have higher self-efficacy than girls. A lot of the time, I always get the feedback like, oh, well, we can't ask them directly because they're lying to us. Well, maybe that's how they feel, and maybe that's what we should be striving for. One example, it's research done by colleagues at UCLA, Jenny Grammer and her grad student Eve Shu, who they looked at anxiety, and again, I might not categorize that as a social emotional learning construct, but I think the example is nice, where they gave girls and boys surveys of their anxiety and then hooked them up to EEG and found that girls reported a lot more anxiety, but when they looked at the brain data, found that it was actually the boys on average were more anxious, and that the boys who answered yes to being anxious on the survey had way higher brain anxiety than the girls did. And so I'm always curious to think about, what's our conclusion? Do we think maybe there's something wrong with the surveys? Do we want to gather more evidence and kind of point out these nuances? I know Katie is going to talk about these correspondence between teacher reports and student reports on constructs of SEL. And a lot of time when we're thinking about validating these measures, we think we want high correlations between the two. But what if we don't find those? What does that mean? Quickly, since I'm almost out of time, I'm really interested in environmental influences in social emotional learning. Again, pointing out the Castle model that has these concentric circles where they put in their model that this happens in classrooms, schools, in the larger community. Some questions I have: how do we think about learning environments as fostering SEL? Is that where schools and classrooms and communities get into the SEL equation? Things like feelings of belonging, is that an SEL construct, or is that almost like a consequence of being in a high SEL environment? I'm gonna skip this slide because it's kind of scary. So I just wanted to open up kind of questions that I've been thinking about is, what's the best way to just think about and describe these constructs? Is non-cognitive the way to go? Do we think about SEL as also does that include a metacognition, self-regulated learning, things like that? What and how do we measure? And this is right now really relevant because we're already going into schools now and measuring these things, and do we make the right decision? And then how do we think about the influence of schools and classrooms on these constructs? So that is the end of my, hopefully just some thoughts that I threw out there. Maybe if someone has one question, we could take one question, or it's probably a broader question, we can wait to the end. Okay, so there's no dying questions right now, so I'm gonna pass it on to Katie. Okay.
Thanks, Matt.
Thank you. I'm gonna keep time. So.
Oh gosh, how strict are you gonna be?
Not very strict.
Okay. Do you mind if I put this?
Oh yeah. Yes.
All right. Good afternoon. My name is Katie Buckley. I am the Managing Director of Research at Transforming Education. And I'm going to talk a little bit today, as Kat mentioned, on some of our research looking at the relationship between student reports and teacher reports of students' social emotional competencies. So what I'll talk about in the next 15 to 20 minutes is a little bit about transforming education, what we do, and in particular our partnership with New Schools Venture Fund. And I want to point out our great partner Jason Atwood is here from New Schools Venture Fund. So if you have any questions specifically about New Schools Venture Fund, please direct them at him. I'll talk a little bit about our study and why we're asking the questions we're asking. Sorry about that. And then what I'm going to do is really focus on sort of the key insights from the data. I'm not going to present a bunch of charts and graphs. Those are all in my appendix. I'm happy to talk about the methods we use. I'm happy to talk about sort of how we thought about the results. But I really want to sort of drive towards what are our key takeaways and then what do they mean for practitioners. All right, so what do we do at Transform Ed? We partner with educators throughout the U.S. to support school systems in fostering the development of students' social emotional development, specifically through this focus on the whole child. So so that all students, particularly those from marginalized backgrounds, can thrive. As we see it, the problem really with schools is that they don't focus on the development of key factors that we believe are essential for lifelong success. So we see our task as really supporting educators in developing and implementing practices and policies that foster the development of the whole child. We do this work by working directly with schools and school systems. We also partner collaboratively with folks like New Schools Venture Fund and others to provide thought partnership and technical assistance. And we collaborate with researchers and policy organizations throughout the US in order to contribute to learning from best practices. And what that really means is taking what we're learning in research now and translating it for practitioners, and taking the questions from practitioners, the things that they're really grappling with, and bringing it back to researchers. I'm not going to go through the list of intended outcomes other than to say sort of our main goal here is really to help students develop the mindset, skills, and habits that support long-term success. We're talking about social emotional development, non-cognitive skills, character, all of those terms that Kat was alluding to. We partnered with organizations and education systems serving 1 million students nationwide, and I'm sort of cheating here because part of our work is with the core districts, so right away we kind of got that 1 million students. And so you can see core districts. We also partnered with other networks of districts, such as the Sel district, a network in Massachusetts. And then we partnered with single districts throughout the US, like DCPS. We partner with other organizations or collaboratives working to directly support the schools. So not only New Schools Venture Fund, but we also are working with the Boston Charter Research Collaborative, a group of high-performing charters in Boston through a research practitioner partnership, along with Marty West at Harvard and the Center for Education Policy Research. And we work with youth-serving organizations that are working to foster students' social emotional development at all ages. And finally, we work with research orgs throughout the US, as I noted before, to bring best practices to the schools we work with. So I want to focus a little more on our partnership with New Schools Venture Fund. New Schools Venture Fund is a national nonprofit venture philanthropy working to reimagine public education. Through our 3-year partnership with them that began in school year 2016-17, we've been working to assist their growing national cohort of schools, known as the New Schools Invent cohort, on expanding the definition of student success. We currently are working with about 64 of those schools nationwide. The partnership is really oriented around 3 primary goals. The first is working directly with school leaders to provide actionable data, research, and support to help those school leaders expand the definition of student success. The second goal is to work directly with New Schools Venture Fund to help provide data for them to understand their portfolio of schools and a variety of metrics. And then we see a third goal is really working with the broader field to contribute to the national dialogue about how to expand the definition of student success and how to implement research practitioner partnerships. Through our work with the New Schools Venture Fund, we, particularly our work with school leaders, we prioritize 7 social emotional competencies and 7 school culture climate factors to assess through student and teacher surveys. So you can see some of these social emotional competencies include growth mindset, perseverance, self-management, social awareness, culture climate factors that include learning strategies, sense of belonging, student-teacher relationships. So in terms of our survey administration in the New Schools Invent cohort, we see this as sort of one part of our work with school leaders to biannually collect data. And then part of that is to bring it back to the schools and support their work through data visualization tools, and ultimately to sort of facilitate knowledge sharing and best practices among this cohort of schools. So the first step is data collection. And so we administer student surveys of social emotional competencies, SEC, and teacher surveys of students' social emotional competencies. And you can see here that for 3 of our competencies, perseverance, self-management, and social awareness, we have both student and teacher data in grades 4 through 12. So on the one hand, this is super exciting because we have an incredibly rich database. On the other, it brings up a lot of questions of how do we make sense of this data? How do we give it back to the schools and help them understand why there's a lack of alignment or why there are differences in alignment across subgroups? And this is really the question that we're struggling with now and we're working through the analyses. Just to give you a flavor of what these surveys look like, you should know these surveys were developed by leading researchers in the field. They were some of the surveys that were implemented, or scales that were implemented in the core districts, have been implemented through our Boston Charter Research Collaborative. These surveys, or scales, excuse me, were developed by folks like Camille Farrington and Angela Duckworth. We also curated scales from NAEP, along with other leading districts such as Washoe County, who, along with AIR and Castle, were developing a scale around self-awareness. So you can see some example items here that were asked of students, and what we did is simply take the items that were asked of students, and we gave those exact items to the teachers. And we said these are certainly observable skills in theory, so we would like you to provide one rating for each scale on whether your students are doing this list of things. So with students, we asked them for each item, please respond on a 1 to 5 Likert scale, where you fall on the spectrum. Usually it was almost always to almost never. And for teachers, we only asked for 1 rating per scale. So let me talk a little bit about this study here. Our primary research question is, how should practitioners use results from student surveys and teacher surveys of students' social emotional competencies to better understand students' social emotional competencies? At its heart, it's really a practitioner-driven question. We're collecting a lot of data. We got to get really good about how we talk about it with schools and leaders. We know a little bit about the alignment of student and teacher reports from the work that Marty West has done, both in CORE and the BCRC, Boston Charter Research Collaborative, where we've had multiple teacher raters and we've had student reports of the same skills. The CEPR work, Marty has sort of taken a little bit further to really ask this question around how much does alignment predict academic and behavioral outcomes. And they have a working paper. I'm not sure if it's been out, but I'm happy to talk a little more about the findings there. We wanted to sort of take a step back, however, and say, before we even get to does alignment matter, really the question is, like, how do we even talk about alignment? Should we expect it? Do we expect it? In what instances do we expect to find alignment? Our research is driven by prior literature. There's quite a bit from sort of well-being and on the personality, big 5 personality traits, in which we have both student and teacher reports. And we tend to find correlations of about 0.3 to 0.6. There's some dispute around, are these differences driven by measurement error, or are we actually measuring sort of different pieces of the kind of SEL or SEC elephant? We also know there are biases inherent in both student and teacher reports, right? A seminal paper by Duckworth and Yeager really talked through the different biases you can find with student reports of their own skills. So, for example, stereotype threat and reference bias. We also see some of the same biases with teacher reports. Some research has found that among certain constructs, such as self-regulation, emotional stability, conscientiousness, teacher reports are actually more predictive than student reports of academic and behavioral outcomes. We subscribe to the self-other knowledge asymmetry model that really posits that self-reports are better at predicting internal traits, while other reports are better at predicting overt behaviors, right? And so the reason why we have 3 scales that have both student and teacher reports is because we only believe that teachers can observe those 3 things about students, self-management, social awareness, and perseverance. But I think the devil's in the details, so I gotta move a little faster here. Devil's in the details. I want to talk a little bit about sort of how we started to distinguish across those scales. Our analytic sample, I'll quickly say, about 1,400 students who had one teacher who, the same teacher who gave both a fall and a spring rating. You can see the makeup of students and teachers is quite different. All right, key insights. What did we find? And I'll note we did a whole bunch of analyses. I'm happy to talk with you about logistic regression, OLS, a bunch of fun stuff. But on average, we find that students underreport relative to the teacher, regardless of school level and student-based ethnicity. This was sort of a surprise for us. In line with sort of social desirability bias, we always assumed that students were going to over-report their skills, and we don't see that on the whole, right, and across subgroups. The difference, average difference in student reports and teacher reports of self-management is about 0.17. all the way to perseverance, where it's about 0.48, and this is on a 1 to 5 Likert scale. What does this suggest? As I noted, we were surprised because we really did expect to find that students were over-reporting relative to teachers. But we think maybe there are probably more salient factors that are affecting how students are rating themselves, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about that on the next slide. We find that underreporting is the greatest in the middle school grades. Now, this is something that is driven primarily by the fact that students tend to decline in their self-perceptions in the middle school grades. And we know this from the core data, where Marty West sort of documented trends across grade levels, and we find a very large decline for most of the competencies in the middle school years. It doesn't really fully recover. This trend for our data is driven solely, as I said, by students declining. And in fact, teachers are actually reporting a little bit higher in the middle school grades than they are in the elementary and high school grades. So there's something happening there with this misalignment driven by students' own self-perceptions and how those might be affected by this middle school transition. I wanted to just say, we'll move on. We also find that there's a greater degree of misalignment in student and teacher reports of student perseverance and social awareness compared to self-management. So this was sort of the puzzle that we started really working through. So we find, for example, the correlation between student and teacher reports for self-management is about 0.42. For perseverance and social awareness, it's about 0.23. So what's happening here? If you recall some of the items that we included for self-management, they were really asking about sort of observable things that I would classify as objective. Did your student come to class on time? Were they prepared and ready to go? The social awareness scale and perseverance scale asks things like, did the students listen carefully? Was the student diligent in not giving up? Right? I think these are things that are much more subjective in nature, and I think this is where we start to see some lack of alignment. And I want to note, we did some additional analyses just to sort of look at whether student and teacher characteristics predict alignment or lack thereof. And we do find initial evidence that African American students and Latino students are less likely to be aligned with their teachers, compared to white students. Lots more analyses to do here, and I don't even want to sort of go beyond this other than to say we kind of, we're excited to sort of dig into this more and figure out what's really happening. All right, connecting insights to practice. Student and teacher surveys appear to offer distinct yet complementary information. I think this is in line with the self-other knowledge asymmetry model. With something like perseverance, we do think that some of the items are asking about a bit more subjective things, perhaps even internal traits. So for example, a teacher might not be a good observer of what it means for a student to work hard in the way that the student perceives it, where the same might not be true of something like self-management, where we're really asking about, again, are you coming to class on time? Our results suggest that, combined with prior literature, we won't get a full picture of students' underlying social emotional competencies with just student reports, given the fact that they tend to underreport in the middle school years. And perhaps reference bias plays a role. I'm sure there are other biases at the individual level that do play a role. I'm happy to talk more about those sort of research in the aggregate around some of these biases and whether or not they play out. I don't think we'd necessarily get a clear picture from just teacher reports, particularly for subjective traits or internal mindsets and beliefs. And I also I disagree with this sort of notion that we can simply average student and teacher reports. I think we're missing a lot of data when we do that and a lot of rich information. My sort of takeaway from this is, while the sort of method for transforming the student scale into a teacher scale was driven by the work of other researchers, for example, Angela Duckworth and the way she did it with her self-management scale, I think we need to think about revising the teacher scales to really focus on things that we believe are externally observable, that we know from theory are rooted in student awareness, mindsets, and beliefs. I think we need to really think carefully about separating out the things that we're measuring from both in order to do three things. First, remove redundancy in the assessments. And second, provide a clearer path for combining results from student and teacher data. And third, provide different sources of data for different purposes. And I know I'm out of time, so I'll just sort of end with this. And forgive me, I created this at midnight last night, so it was super clear then. It might not be as clear now. But if you think about sort of a construct X, and we have a sort of, you know, as a student, I have observable behaviors around this construct. I have my own mindsets and awareness and belief around this construct, and I have my own perceptions of how I'm acting. My own identity, for example. I think we can think about this in a Venn diagram here, and if we think about sort of observable behaviors that the teacher notices and student mindsets, awareness, and beliefs, I think that provides a really powerful opportunity for educator insight, for an educator to sit down, sort of look at the data and say, what is driving, what's happening that the student's feeling and thinking that might be driving the behaviors that I'm seeing. I think if we think about sort of students reflecting on their own internal beliefs and their behaviors, I think over time the students can start to look and self-reflect about their own growth in some of these competencies. And then I think having a sort of both of what teachers are observing and what students are perceiving of their actions, and I think that can provide really rich fodder for a conversation between students and teachers, particularly when there might be mismatch, for students to really clearly talk about, yeah, I was working hard, and let me tell you about why I think that I am a hard worker in this avenue. And I think we can get to sort of a summative score somewhere in the middle. Again, not a simple sort of average, but I think we could get some pretty bright minds in the room to really think about how to pull that off. But of course, lots more work to do. A lot more has been done around aggregating indicators for things like school quality or high school graduation readiness. We've done far less work in this realm. And I think the picture gets way more murkier when we add in things like performance-based tasks, which is a future study, so stay tuned. Thank you.
Are there any burning questions for you? Okay.
Thank you, Kat. Good afternoon, everyone. So I'm going to make the argument that feelings of belong in any contemporary analysis of social emotional learning. And so I want to talk today about students' feelings of belonging in school. And by belonging, I mean how much they feel like they're part of the school culture, they fit in, and they are accepted and respected by others. And the desire to belong has been conceptualized as a fundamental human motive by motivational psychology. First of my Hughes presenter view in a really long time. That's not me. May have to rely on my memory, not so much on what's written, what I have here in my notes. But the desire to belong has been conceptualized by motivational psychologists and social emotional learning researchers too, as a fundamental human motive, which means it drives behavior. And so many researchers have been concerned with school or classroom or environmental factors that may interfere with students' ability to express their motive to belong, because it's a fundamental human need. And I want to talk about the relationships between school belonging and the ethnic context and the ways in which more or less ethnic diversity in school or the size of one's own ethnic group intersects with feelings of belonging, and hence my title. So why ethnicity? Moving forward?
Yeah, let's get arrows.
All right, you've probably seen similar figures like this, especially now in the Trump era. The racial ethnic diversity of our country and the changing racial ethnic diversity is a topic of great concern and conversation. And this is the racial ethnic composition of our country for about the last 100 years, beginning in 1920, when there were about 100 million people in the United States. And you can see here that my colors are coming through. The chartreuse is whites, that little blue is African Americans. Back in 1920, we were basically a biracial society with a very large white group and a small African American group. The other racial ethnic groups, well, this is based on census data, weren't even counted very well back then. Over the generations, these are 20-year increments in census data, you can see a clear trend. Whites have decreased in their representation, Latinos have increased, African Americans have stayed about the same. And so by 2010, the whites who were 90% of the population in 1910 were only 64% by 2010, projecting out to 2040 and 2060. California has already passed this critical 50% mark, but by 2040 and 2060, whites will clearly no longer be the new racial ethnic American majority in this country. You know, if you think about how we've gone from being a biracial society to a fully multiracial society, and if you think about, so how is this pattern of demographic changes, how does that get played out in schools in the under 18 population? You're always going to see more rapid change in the under 18 population because a lot of the increasing diversity that we see is due to immigration and different birth rates in different racial ethnic groups. So this next slide shows based on NCES data, the changing demographics in the K-12 public school population. That's not been 20. NCES is usually 3 to 4 years behind, but you can see the exact same patterns from 1968 to 2014. In 1968, 80% of the school kids in public schools were white. By 2014, only 50%, a little over 50%. The 2014 in the K-12 population is like the projected 2040 in the full population. So there's more rapid change in the under 18 population. And so kids, within the next generation, there's clearly not going to be a racial ethnic numerical majority of kids in K-12 schools, and schools will be the first major institution in our society without a clear racial ethnic majority. So these are dramatic changes. So then the question is, you know, the population is changing so rapidly, the demographics are shifting. Are the schools keeping up with that change? If I had more time, I would show you a set of provocative slides where the answer to that is absolutely no. The typical whites, in fact, the schools are more racially segregated than they are now than they were in the years just following Brown v. Board of Education in 1954. The typical white student attends schools where 80% of the students are white. The typical African American Latino student attends schools where at least 3/4 of the students are of their racial ethnic group. If you look at some schools in large inner city school districts like LAUSD and New York and Chicago, I have some slides that really show that the schools in these large inner city areas are predominantly racial ethnic minority. So as the population has increased in diversity, the schools have become more racially and ethnically segregated. And the reason why that's a concern for us, it's not that the fact that the schools don't have white kids. The fact is that these highly segregated inner city schools have fewer resources than schools that are more affluent and have more white and Asian students. And so that's the reason why we need to be concerned about this. And as all of this progress made in the 60s and 70s with the Supreme Court decisions have gradually been rolled back, and people argue that, well, it isn't about school diversity or SES diversity. Those aren't the critical issues because they'll argue that the research hasn't been very good. And they criticize it as being outdated, methodologically weak, too focused on black-white comparisons, not enough theory involved. And so our argument is that in order to the best counter-argument to these analyses that we don't need to worry about school racial ethnic diversity is that we need rigorous programs of research including multiple racial ethnic groups, and that test theories and test hypotheses about how diversity matters rather than if it does. And so that's what we try to do in our research. And this is all leading up to my belonging here. And so in our work, we've been testing systematic and developmental social psychologists, and we've been testing systematic hypotheses that are research and theory based on why ethnic diversity, how ethnic diversity benefits everyone. And I tend to focus on adolescents, early adolescents in particular. This is our middle school study. And the argument is that greater ethnic diversity in middle schools leads to some social psychological processes, more opportunities to form cross-ethnic friendships, more exposure to multiple groups, or more balance of power between different racial ethnic groups. These lead to some important psychosocial outcomes, which I think map very well onto social emotional learning, like better attitudes about other people, better mental health, and these in turn have an effect on school functioning. And we look at in multiple indicators of all of our constructs. One of the important indicators of school functioning is school belonging. And so through this process of diversity impacting these various layered social psychological processes, we want to argue that school belonging, that diversity contributes in important ways to school belonging and it's beneficial to everyone. So that's kind of where I get from from the topic of this presentation. So I'm going to skip all this stuff in the middle, and I'm going to give you some examples of how ethnic diversity is related to school belonging. Okay? So briefly about our sample, I'm going to give you 3 illustrations of how I think we need to think about belonging, feelings of belonging in the context of racial ethnic diversity. So if you're going to do this, if you're going to make an argument that diversity is important and it's important for all racial ethnic groups, you need to have a large sample, and they need to be diverse. And so we recruited 26 middle schools. And the idea is that all of the major pan-racial ethnic groups would be represented in schools where they were the majority group. That's not very diverse. Maybe in contexts where there were 2 balanced groups, and in very diverse schools. So we set out to fill all these cells. And with a lot of hard work, we never filled all of them. But by the 3 cohorts, we achieved 6,000 students, and we follow longitudinally across the 3 years of middle school in LAUSD and surrounding middle schools, where every racial group was represented in schools where they were the majority group, kind of balanced 50-50, and in very diverse schools, so that we were able to see for all of the constructs we're interested in, how for every racial ethnic group does increasing diversity affect that construct. We have really good measures of diversity. Did I do that? Okay. I like to use my own. We have great measures of diversity. This is the diversity index. Lots of people use it. Basically, you take all of the individual racial ethnic groups in a school, you sum them, you square them, you sum them, you subtract it from 1, and it gives you the probability that any 2 randomly selected kids in a school will be from a different racial ethnic group. So the higher the diversity index, the greater the likelihood that you're going to have 2 kids from different racial ethnic groups. So high numbers indicate more diversity. So all of our schools get a diversity score. I'm going to give you 3 examples: belonging and school diversity. The first one is school belonging across the middle school transition. So, I have 5 minutes left. Okay, I got it. Because like Katie, I'm not going to be giving you a lot of data here, no statistics, just findings. So, the middle school transition, you probably know this research, it's challenging. Any school transition is challenging. And Jackie Eccles and other motivational psychologists have written beautifully and persuasively about the challenges of the middle school transition, the mismatches when you're in this adolescent period and you're going from a small elementary school to a big middle school, you're leaving your friends behind, you have to establish new relationships with teachers at a time when your own feeling of connectedness is so important. You've got this normative evaluation when you're so focused on yourself. So there are a lot of reasons why motivation declines across that middle school transition. One factor that these researchers, as wonderful as their work is, has not addressed is what are some unique mismatches that involve race and ethnicity that might interfere with the middle school transition. So sometimes illustrations show it better than text. So imagine that this is me, I'm in the center. This is me in elementary school. 44% of the kids are my racial ethnic group. Then I transition to a middle school where 46% of the kids are my racial ethnic group. We call that a match in terms of the representation of your racial ethnic group across this critical middle school transition. But look what happens when there's a mismatch. When I was in elementary school, 75% of the kids were my same racial ethnic group. Then I transitioned to a bigger middle school where only 25% of the kids are like me. That's a mismatch. Does this mismatch in the representation of my group across the critical transition, does that have any impact on feelings of belonging? So that was our question in this study here. And you looked at the percent saying in middle school, you look at the percents, you subtract the percent saying in elementary school, and you get a score, an index. Higher the number, the more likely it is that there are going to be more people like you in middle school than in elementary school. And we had a great range here. The mean was minus 0.2, which means on average, kids are going to middle schools where fewer people like them than their elementary school, which is typical what happens when around here you might be in these sort of homogeneous small elementary schools, and then if you go to your local public middle school, it's going to be a lot more racially ethnically diverse. So your group is shrinking. What happens with that? And so then we need a good measure of school belonging. I'm really very, just like the prior presenters, really very concerned about measurement. We make up our own, we adapt them. This isn't rocket science. School belonging is I feel like I'm part of the school, close to people, I feel respected, feel like I belong. So these hang together, and we use ratings for sure, yes to no way. So then when we look, so here's what, and we also look at school racial ethnic diversity as a possible moderator. So these are the findings on the x-axis. On the y-axis is school belonging. On the x-axis is this change from elementary school to middle school. When there's fewer people, this is just I'm just illustrating with our Latino population here. Fewer people like you in middle school, that could be the mismatch to more people like you in middle school. And you can see here that this is the problem area over here. This is where you see the differences, that when there are fewer people like you in middle school compared to elementary school, you feel less like you belong, unless you're in a diverse school. Diversity is an important moderator of these effects. So my first take-home message for you is that ethnic minority students feel less like they belong when a critical mass of same ethnicity peers declines across the transition. This critical mass, but diversity buffers those feelings. And that's our whole argument, that greater school diversity can be a buffer, can be positive. So attending a diverse school with more ethnic groups that are about equally represented should make the size of one's own ethnic group less salient, in addition to providing opportunities for more cross-ethnic interactions. That's the advantage of more diversity in this case. Perhaps your group won't be so salient, and you won't feel this drop in the representation of your group across that transition. Am I making sense? Okay, next example. Okay, within school segregation over time and belongingness. Okay, that was just the transition to middle school, from elementary school to middle school. What about what happens to you throughout middle school? How does the representation of your group, for example, in the classes that you're taking, how does that influence your feelings of belonging? So let me again illustrate with our great stick figures. So let's say this is the red guy, let's say this is me. About 20% of the people in my school are my racial ethnic group, in my middle school, okay? And so I'm in a diverse school, about 20% of the people are like me. But what about my classes that I'm taking? If I have a really good measure to look at the ethnic composition of your particular classes, how does the composition of your classes match or not match your representation in school? And so it could be this is lower same ethnicity representation, less segregation. So this is the number of people like me in Emerson Middle School, but in my classes there are not so many people like me. So this is less segregation. On the other hand, there might be a lot more segregation in my classes than in my school. Here, there's 45% of the kids in my classes are my ethnic group compared to the school representation of my group. This is more segregation in classes. We had a way to tabulate this, but I have excellent students and former students who are really good at thinking about diversity as dynamic and changing over time. It's more than just structural school diversity. And so we were able to calculate kids who were in kids' classes and how is that similar or different from their representation at the school level. And indeed, we found this is over the 4 years of middle school, and we're looking at what's called in research, longitudinal research, within-person change. So if my exposure to segregated classes is more or less than typical, how does that affect my feelings of belonging at that particular time? And yes, it does. So if you look at the 4 time points across middle schools, when I'm in more segregated classes, that means we're clustered together, and in our classes we're more than we are in the school, we feel less like we belong. At times when we're less segregated, I feel like I belong, and then this could be the average. So with in-person change, and what's particularly interesting about this is that this impact of segregation on feelings of belonging is stronger for kids who are the numerical minority in their class. So you see this effect of segregation within classes compared to the school impacting kids when there's not that many people like them in the first place and they're segregated in their classes. That impacts their feeling of belonging. So my second take-home message is just diversity is more than the structural type. It's also who every individual is exposed to throughout the day and the school year. Okay, last example, feelings of belonging in math. So the 9th grade transition is just as tumultuous as the middle school transition. It's probably worse because there's more at stake. And people talk a lot about ninth grade math. It's typically algebra, although in California more and more students are taking algebra in the 8th grade. But historically that 9th grade math is a gatekeeper. If you don't pass 9th grade math, your likelihood of not graduating from high school goes up exponentially. So we're interested in hearing, what about kids' feelings of belonging in math? So not school-wide, how about in your particular math class? So we do everybody's math in 9th grade. We developed a new measure of math belonging. Now, Carol Dweck and others, the mindset people, have also started to look at belongingness in college STEM courses, so we're certainly not the first people to do this. But thinking about math, do I feel like I fit in? Do I feel respected? Do I feel left out, reverse score? Do I feel like nobody pays attention to me in math? This is feeling like you belong in math. And then we ask the kids, how many kids are of your same ethnic group in your math class? And so this is subjective perception of representation of your group from hardly any to a lot. And there were percentages that they worked with. And we also looked at ethnic context moderators. In this case, we were concerned about what is the overall ethnic climate in the schools. Do kids think teachers encourage kids from different racial ethnic groups to interact with one another? That might be a moderator, and it was. I almost finished. I'm taking 31 more minutes. And so same ethnic representation, feelings of belonging in math, and when there weren't very many kids like you in your math, you felt like you didn't belong. But if the ethnic climate was good, that buffered that feeling. So my final third take-home message is that ethnic minority students feel less like they belong in 9th grade math when there are few perceived classmates like me, but a positive ethnic climate buffers those feelings. Quick conclusions, a critical mass of same ethnic peers is important. Critical mass, this is an important theoretical question. What's the critical mass? Is it 15%? Is it 17%? Is it 22%? We don't know that yet. What we know is that when there are too few people like you in an environment, you feel alienated and it makes it more difficult for you to do well in school. But segregating people like me in classes diminishes school belonging over time, especially for small minorities. So it's complex in terms of your larger experiences in the school, and greater school diversity, more groups of relatively equal size, and a climate of inclusiveness can buffer the challenges to belonging among ethnically diverse youth. The last thing I want to say is this is a critical time to be studying the benefits and challenges of school diversity for different groups, as well as testing hypotheses like we try to do about testing hypotheses and about the measurement and the meaning of race, ethnicity, and diversity. This is a critical time to be doing this, and today's multi-ethnic schools are the perfect context for doing this. Okay, I made it.
I'm curious about observed objective racial ethnic composition versus perceived. If there's, Sandra, have you guys thought that?
Well, they correlate, but not strongly. It's probably like the student and the teacher. But I'm a social psychologist, so I believe that the subjective perception of your experiences are just as important as the objective. So if the two don't match perfectly, that isn't going to throw me off in terms of my research. Sometimes you have unique hypotheses related to the subjective perception versus the objective.
Yeah, I'm curious, just from what Katie was saying earlier, how predominantly white teachers are scoring white children differently than children of color, and now we're talking about ethnic diversity. And I'm curious how that relationship, or if you're going to look into that of not just your peers, but who's actually in charge and who's teaching you?
We have some measures of teachers' perceptions of the academic engagement of their students. I'm much more interested in kids. You can't do everything, but I think it's probably not inconsistent with what Katie said, that when it comes to the relationship between actual achievement and the teacher's perception of how well the kids are doing is stronger in white and Asian kids than it is in African American Latino kids. So it suggests that there are some other factors other than their objective achievement that go into their judgments of the kids. So yes, there's some differences in this relationship between teachers' perceptions and the kids' actual achievement.
And maybe not just perceptions, but actual
Behavior.
Or no, just the makeup of the teachers, like who's in the classroom versus the makeup of the school.
Right, so this people try to study the differences between the ethnic composition of the student body and the ethnic composition of the teaching force. It's hard to do that since 70 to 80% of the teachers in this country are white. It's more diverse in LAUSD, but it's still a predominantly white teaching force.
Thank you. We're going to move to a presentation by Jessica Berlinski.
Thank you. That was great, and at first I was not happy that I was last, and now after hearing everyone speak, I'm really glad because I think this makes sense now, more sense. And my name is Jessica Berlinski, and I head up all K-12 work at a company called Ripple Effects, which you'll see more about that. I'm not going to go into that company now, but you'll see that incorporates into what I'm going to talk about today. And so, as the title of my talk here makes reference, I'm going to talk about an approach to assessment where literally the assessment is baked into the intervention itself. So the intervention serves to, and we're talking about social emotional learning, intervention and assessment. The intervention itself supports the student and at the same time serves to facilitate that learner's choosing of what they need the most support with. So that's what I mean by this. And Kat, here. Got it. Okay, beautiful, thank you. So, why do we need, what is the benefit of SEL assessment data? And Katie talked about her goal, which was to better understand students, and I think these three take that one step further, which is identifying safety and climate issues so that they can be addressed, right? And some of those are belonging, right? So that we can make them more inclusive prospectively. To measure pre-post, right? So we want to know if the intervention or if the program that we're implementing is working. And then third, formative. We want to be able to aid educators in directing students to the most appropriate, the best match, the best intervention for their needs based on the data that we get. And that's really where I'm going to focus today, is this formative piece, and why this kind of combination really supports that in a very meaningful way. So traditional social emotional learning assessments, both Katie and Kat touched on this. So we have observational, we have direct or performance-based assessments, and those can be game-based. And then we have self-report, typically student self-report. And although we have pros to all of these, we also have flaws or challenges with them. And Katie also pointed to some of those. So with behavior or observational assessments, accuracy, there are bias, they're subjective. Adults might observe something in the classroom that they're not seeing in the playground. With performance-based assessments, they're not contextualized, so I might do great in this simulation, but does that translate into all environments? And then self-report is somewhat limited to mindsets, this has been discussed. And also Katie talked about how the self-awareness changes over time, and sometimes kids report themselves lower after they've had an intervention. So this we'll see, and we'll see this a little bit later on after I show an example of this. This idea of integrating these two has a number of benefits in terms of addressing those flaws, but why is it needed just from a practical standpoint? Well, educators want a solution. You know, they have all this assessment data. They're doing, you know, those 64 schools are doing that work, and I would guess that you would corroborate that they then want to say, okay, so now what? Like, now how do I help these kids? And maybe you too would corroborate that. So they want that solution after getting this data. And they have limited capacity oftentimes, right? Time is a big factor in terms of going through all that data, the resources to adapt instruction, right? And then experience. Not everyone is a behavioral psychologist or has the ability to adapt SEL data to learning objectives and then adapt that curricula to where it needs to go for each learner. So where do we start? How do we do this? What's our starting point? It's adaptive technology, personalized adaptive technology. So some of the kind of broader affordances of this kind of technology is greater accessibility for students. We're able to, with technology, and Roar Saxberg talked a little bit about this, provide students with different modes, modalities of learning. Access to feedback is certainly easier and faster with tech. And we also have the ability to offer a greater scope of content and then pathways through that content. So the example that I'm going to use is, no surprise, ripple effects. And ripple effects is a digital, obviously, intervention or program that tailors support for the whole child. Importantly, and these are just some kind of highlights, but I'm going to get to a demo here, and we're going to cross our fingers that our tech, our demo works. It is student-directed, and that's really critical here. So, and when it comes to this marriage, right, of learning and assessment, so the students choose their content, and they choose how they want to learn. It's trauma-informed, it's evidence-based, which is important. I don't think I would be here if we didn't know that this worked and serves to improve social emotional learning skills, behavior, and academic performance. And I'm going to circle back to the data after the demo. And it advances equity really importantly. So both because the content itself is culturally responsive, but also because by its very nature and structure, it's meeting each learner's needs, which we know are different. And so how? Incorporating universal design for learning principles. So what we want to be able to do is to maximize accessibility for students whom we know, right, have diverse learning styles, abilities, attention spans, and cultural orientations. And so the kind of backbone of this system is going to show information in different ways, different modes of learning. It's going to allow learners to demonstrate what they know in different ways. And then it's going to provide multiple means of engagement or motivation. And that's where that stickiness comes in. So I want to go to the demo now because I think this is a screen grab, but I think it's far more interesting to actually see live like how this works. And so Kat, you're going to be our student here.
Okay.
Okay, awesome. And so is our volume on?
Our volume is on.
Okay, so can you put in Jessica, my name, capital J, Berlinski. Student ID is JB, capital, 123456. And then the password is Ripple, capital R. And let's do a girl, I'm a girl. Oh, God. God, this is what we did not want to happen.
Did I type it in wrong?
No, I don't think so. Sometimes it glitches. Okay. Do you want...
Ripple has two P's. Yeah.
All right. Can you redo it? Is that possible?
This whole thing?
No. Like, just do the link again. We're trying not to make this happen. And as luck would have it. Yeah, let's, okay.
First time using any ripple effects program, choose the first time button. If you've already signed up and know your name, ID, and password, enter them here. Then pick a guide and go.
IPPLE. Oh my God, I can't believe it. All right, we're gonna try another student.
Another fake student.
Yeah, we're gonna try another fake student. Yeah, we're gonna try to do this. And then capital T. And then password is, and then his boy. Okay. Okay, nice. Okay, awesome. We're in. So thank you, Kat. Props. Okay. So this is the, and this is like the speed demo of this. I mean, typically my demos are about like 30 to 40 minutes with questions, and so this is going to be like a 3 to 4 minute demo. So we're not going to see, is it possible to move it up so we can see the bottom? Yeah. Okay, great. So these are our guides through this system, and is the volume on?
Yes.
Okay. So there's 2 entry points, which is really critical here. Keys and topics. So keys represent skills, and under keys, can you press on keys, Kat?
Together can open almost any door for you. Get you into college, bring you friends, help protect you from harm. With effort and practice, anyone can master these 5 skill sets. Choose a key to get started.
So as you can see here, Kat talked about the CASTLE core competencies, and this is aligned to those kind of 5 competency areas. And under each one of them is a long list of lesson topics. And probably all told, there's about 200 lessons under the keys area. And a lot of those are around belonging, inclusiveness, identity, cultural identity. So there's a deep baking in of social emotional learning and that kind of cultural inclusive identity building piece here. But now let's go to topics. Let's go back to topics.
Look up a topic, or choose a letter it begins with. When you find your topic, select it. Then use any button on the bottom of the screen in any order to explore it.
So keys represents skills, topics represents behaviors and personal challenges. So this long list, and could you be a student for us and just kind of scroll down here? So you can see this is the teens program, and there's this long list of personal issues that students can choose to learn social emotional learning and resiliency skills around. So what we have here and what we advocate, and what usually the way this is implemented is an educator might choose controlling impulses, right? Because they know that that's a skill that they want to build. But then the idea is, the way this program is meant to work is to give the student agency to also choose whatever it is that they think might be underneath their behavior, or whatever it is that they're struggling with, or whatever it is that they want to learn more about. So again, we're giving them choice. We're giving them the ability to assess, to self-reflect, and then choose what they want to learn. So let's go to, as our example, if you would go back to keys, let's look at controlling impulses.
Used together can open almost any door for you.
Yeah,
Get you into
there.
college.
Click.
Many teens' biggest challenge.
So we're having a little trouble with the audio. It comes out right at the beginning, but
Upset, she often reacts before she even knows what's going on. She gets into fights and hurts people's feelings because of it. Tanya wishes that she had more self-control, but doesn't know how to get it.
so Kat, is it possible to scroll up a little so we can see? Yeah, perfect. So on the bottom here, this is the structure of every lesson in this program. And what these are on the bottom, this what if is kind of a case study to ground us in this skill or this personal challenge. But each one of those represent a different modality of learning, a different research-based modality. So info is cognitive, how-to, skills and strategies. True story is a true story video of a real child who has been through either navigating this skill or this specific issue and how they dealt with it. Modeling is also a video. So again, we're representing knowledge in a number of different ways here of a skill, of what these skills look like in practice. Brain is interactive journaling. So again, we actually have a mode of assessment as a learning modality, right? This reflection, this self-reflection. And that brain modality asks the student to reflect around their experience, their feelings, their goals, and who can help, right? So that kind of full wheel around whatever this lesson topic or issue is for them. Apply it, our transfer exercises, and normally I would show you each one of these, but I'm just gonna show you one since we have limited time. Profile is again an actual assessment modality as a learning modality. And so that's a self-profile. So that's the one we're gonna choose. Here we go.
Statements. Rank the statements by dragging the most like me box in front of the statement that best describes you, the second most like me box in front of the statement that next best characterizes you, and so on. Assign only one like me box to each statement. Fill in every box. If you can't find a statement that best describes you, start with one that is least like you.
Don't think
then
about
work
it,
your way back to a
just do it
default for most like you. Take your time. There are no right or wrong answers. All the choices are equally good. The profile is like using a mirror to look into your own mind.
So this is one of the modalities, which is understanding yourself on a graph of controlling impulses. So we're not going to listen to the full analysis of this, but we'll get a taste of what the student can understand about themselves. And again, as you can see here, this is another form of assessment, traditional assessment, almost baked in to this broader intervention.
There's two things that are greatly connected to success in life and are connected in an opposite way to chances of getting hurt or in trouble. They are how quickly you give into your impulses and how much you are drawn to risk and excitement. Your answer suggests you're about in the middle on both things. You don't appear to be highly impulsive. You probably wouldn't
Very
first.
Okay, so we can go out of this just
But you're
because we're
not
not
yet
going to
fully
have
in
time
control of your
this goes on
impulses
for a
either.
bit. But it's unique to each student, and that's really where, again, what we're kind of getting after here is this idea, which I think universal design for learning principles are based on, that no student is equal, right? So very quickly, data. And I failed, we hit that profile mode before we got to the very last modality, which is a knowledge check, which is a gamified knowledge check. So there's 10 modes of learning for each one of those, and total there's 420 lessons, right? And they can be on anything from, there's some pretty intense topics, I don't know if you could see, but abuse, sexual situations, drugs, a parent is an alcoholic, the things that real kids are going through and need to build these skills around. So the data shows positive impacts in social emotional learning, grades, and behavior. But what's important is that change was always seen when the students could choose themselves the content. So there were some students, there's been over 8 RCTs on this particular intervention, and in some of them the students would not do the prescribed lessons, and it didn't matter. The changes were still seen. So that autonomy and that student selection and that ability of the student to do that self-assessing is critical. So benefits, when we think of this kind of new concept, right, of assessment where we're marrying these two, we're kind of baking it in, what are some of the real world benefits of this? Well, we have 2 in 1, thanks Kat. We have the solution, right, within the assessment. Greater accuracy, right? A lot of times, like we talked about that as a flaw, that adults don't always know what's going on with students, and students actually have a pretty sharp level of insight around where they need support. Reduction of educator bias, that contextualization, again, is key. We're building social emotional learning skills specifically around what the students themselves are finding salience and meaning in. Immediacy, there's no lag, right? So with the data that you both did, you got the data and then you looked at the data and then you had to decide, okay, this is right how we're gonna help. So here it's just kind of all rolled into one, it's real time. Content isn't arbitrated between an adult mediator, and it's a light lift for educators, ultimately. So kind of in closing, what we're seeing here is just kind of this new concept of leveraging adaptive technology. But most importantly, as we kind of move into an understanding, and I think a broad understanding both at the research level and at the practitioner level of the importance of student agency, this really encapsulates that. So we're giving kids autonomy and agency to be a part of their own intervention. And specifically David Yeager's work, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with, shows that adolescents at that critical middle school level and higher, that's what they respond to. They respond to a sense of respect, independence, autonomy. And so this tends to be a real sweet spot with this program because students feel, again, they feel they know best, right? At that level, they don't necessarily want to be told, and this is something that kind of gives them that opportunity. So it's something to think about. It's a new way to think about, and I guess I'm sure my time is up. So yeah.
So we have about 9 minutes for questions for any of us. So I'll leave it open to you guys. Yeah.
So I feel like I just keep asking a lot of questions. It's actually to you, Katie, in your survey administration, in your data collection. So I'm wondering, we get a lot of human error in our data collection. And so we use SurveyMonkey, and even though we tell people we use the same ID, of course, when we try to match, it's like 30 or 40%, right, for our matched pairs. And you said you do this twice a year?
Yeah.
Do you do like a matched pair analysis for levels of increase? And when you're looking at it, are you looking at the specific students relevant to their teachers? Like, I'm just wondering how deep your analysis is going.
So is your question, are we looking at changes in students' perceptions from fall to spring?
Yes, and what's your basically best practices on data?
Yeah, so best practices we tend to use, so I think with New Schools Benchmark we partner with Panorama, and we administer the survey for them, so they take care of all of the data administration. We're not an administration or data administration, survey administration org. Or My Student Survey, we've been using them as well. So I can't really talk about sort of the administration component because they handle all that. I will say a lot of, we've looked a lot at changes from fall to spring, and we know that there tends to be decline. So the way students are perceiving of their skills in the fall is typically a little bit higher on average than how they're perceiving of their skills in the spring. And this makes sense, I think, anecdotally, right? Like I come in, I remember as a grad student, I came into the school year like, yes, I got this. Like I'm gonna kick ass, right? And then at the end of the year, you've gotten some tests back and you've had some iffy interactions with professors and you're like, gosh, I'm not feeling this great, right? And so you see that decline, it plays out. So we see the decline in fall to spring, and then we kind of see the decline, right, 3rd grade to 4th grade to 5th grade. That said, we know from research with the core data and Boston Charter Research Collaborative, there is sort of signal in that change. So students who decline less or improve from fall to spring tend to have greater academic outcomes and behavioral outcomes. So there's something there. The tricky part is how do you frame that to educators? And this is where we really hone in on, this is why we can't, this is not we can't use this as a test for an intervention, right? It's not a pre and post test. We use a lot of language on this is student voice data, this is teacher voice data. This is not assessment scores. And so this is not to be taken as sort of you educator or school leader did something wrong or something you did led to a lack or more of a fixed mindset among your students. Rather, we expect this change. But let's start to look for the bright spots. Where are we actually seeing improvements in grades? And what was happening in those grades where students are actually leaving feeling like, yes, I do have more of a growth mindset. And so that's what we're really focused on with educators is digging into the data a bit more within their school to say what's happening with specific groups or grade levels that we think might shine a light on some promising practices that can be spread to the other teachers and other grade levels. Any other questions?
Yeah. You mentioned at the beginning, Kat, about Kansas and Illinois. So I have 2 questions around what the states are doing. One is, do you know what informed their Sel Standards. They did dip into research. Are they looking at the kinds of data that's been generated and results that have been generated that you've described here today? And the second is, do we know, is this sort of the tip of the iceberg? Are other states beginning to do something comparable? Are they more or less reinventing what Kansas and Illinois have, or are they doing something more innovative that if any of you know about at the state level, what might be happening?
Yeah, I haven't looked too deeply into the origins of the Kansas and Illinois standards. I'm assuming that I'm sure they had experts and researchers and all of that convened to knowing how standards creation goes.
Yeah.
So I would assume so, and by looking at them, they look good. Right, so it doesn't look like a complete mess. And then the project that Katie and I work on analyzing the core PACE data. So California, another state, they don't have SEL standards, but they are measuring this yearly grades 3 to 12. So to me, it's kind of incredible to see how much money and how many experts' minds are going into this when it's, I would say, a relatively new thing to do. If you think about more than a century of our time has spent on thinking about measurement of math, intelligence, English language arts skills, and a little bit more on these cognitive executive functioning skills. And now we're kind of at that age of motivation SEL. We still have so much more to figure out on the measurement side. And then to already deploy it to 800,000 kids a year, I think is, we shouldn't be too worried if we don't find what we want. I think it's too early.
So, but you're optimistic about the way it's going, about the support and interest from states?
I don't know how honest I want to be, especially since this is videotape. I'm a little bit worried that it's going into the direction of treating it like academic achievement.
Mm-hmm.
That's the thing that we're looking at growth curves now and doing IRT models that were developed for binary dichotomous test scores, right, items. So yeah, I'm optimistic that we can help things.
So can I say something? So thinking about racial diversity, so Kansas is one of those states that's had an influx of Latinos in the last 20, 30 years as Latino immigrants have moved east looking for opportunity and a better way of life. So this is a number of these Midwestern states that have been predominantly white forever. Now they're having, in the last 20 years, to confront a large influx of Latinos and different birth rates. The population is going to grow quickly. To me, if you want to understand social emotional learning, that's absolutely the way we should be looking at it. Because how you feel in school and perseverance and grit and mindset and all of these things that you talk about are going to be impacted by your own history and the representation of your group in the schools. It's really fundamental to understanding SEL at this large level when you're looking at the large population, taking into account demographic changes.
And I think most of those, I can't speak to the standards, but I know that in terms of the measures, and you can probably corroborate this, they're not validated at this point for subgroups, right?
We're working,
It's being worked on,
it's being worked on. And I mean, when you say validated by subgroups, at a basic level, we can show that the measurement is the same across groups, but maybe that's not enough.
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
What is
Right.
that?
So I think it's progress, right?
Yeah.
Because wouldn't you say some of those items that you see there in those standards are very culturally prescribed and normative? And if you look cross-culturally, maybe certain aspects of those standards would not be appropriate or apply. And I do worry a little bit that we're trying to even things out and work towards standards so things could be more uniform and fair. But on the other extreme, they may discount what certain communities value and really want for their children. So I think that's possibly already debated in what's right or wrong about math standards and other kinds of standards. But this area seems to be, to me, to be particularly fraught with potential for certain communities to really want to push back on setting normative and sort of values about certain socio-emotional types of learning, knowledge, and skills, as you've talked about these different aspects.
Yeah, that's one of the things that we're applying for funding for right now is to do these cognitive interviews with different gender, racial, ethnic groups, and it's kind of sad to think that that happens after the survey administration, right? You would hope it happens before.
I think something else to think about is that the large grouping of Latino and even Asian represents so many different cultures.
Yeah,
And I
that
think we
there's
need to
even
get more
heterogeneity.
micro in terms of looking at ethnicity, if culture is going to be one of the aspects.
Yeah, look
When I
at
was
class.
when I was in the Bay Area, the 5 or 6 Asian groups, totally different cultures.
Especially
Always
Cal.
approaching the reporter.
Thanks. Unfortunately, we'll have to cut our conversation short because this room is being used next, but thank you so much for coming.
Thank you all.